The scratching started at 3:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning in late September. I know the exact time because I've been staring at the alarm clock beside my bed for the past 2 hours, unable to sleep in the house that still smelled like Richard's cologne. The sound was persistent, rhythmic, coming from somewhere in the backyard. At first I thought it was a raccoon going through the trash bins. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A whimper low and mournful, that I would have recognized anywhere. It was Max, my late husband's German Shepherd, the dog we'd buried 6 months ago in the pet cemetery across town. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Rebecca Chun, and at 71 years old, I thought I'd seen everything life could throw at me. I'd raised 3 daughters mostly on my own while Richard worked 60-hour weeks building his construction company. I'd survived breast cancer at 52. I'd nursed Richard through his final weeks of pancreatic cancer just 6 months earlier, watching the man I'd loved for 48 years fade away in the guest bedroom we'd converted into a hospice room. I'd held his hand as he took his last breath on a rainy March morning, whispering that he didn't need to fight anymore. I'd scattered half his ashes in the garden where he'd spent countless Sunday mornings tending his tomato plants, and kept the other half in an urn on the mantel because I wasn't ready to let all of him go. 2 weeks after Richard died, Max stopped eating. The vet said it was grief, that dogs sometimes died of broken hearts just like people. Max had been Richard's constant companion for 12 years, following him from room to room, sleeping beside his bed, waiting by the door every evening for him to come home from work. When Richard got sick, Max never left his side. He'd lie on the floor next to the hospital bed, his gray muzzle resting on his paws, his dark eyes watching Richard with an intensity that broke my heart. The morning Max died, I found him in Richard's study, curled up on the leather chair where Richard used to sit and read the newspaper. He looked peaceful, like he was just sleeping. But when I touched his fur, it was already cold. Dr. Patricia Morales, our veterinarian for over a decade, said his heart had simply given out. She helped me make arrangements with Evergreen Pet Memorial, and I buried Max with Richard's favorite baseball cap, the one from the Yankees game we'd gone to on our 20th anniversary. That was 6 months ago. I grieved for Max almost as much as I'd grieved for Richard, because losing them both felt like losing the last pieces of the life I'd built. My daughters had been supportive in their own ways. Elena, my oldest at 46, had flown in from Seattle and stayed for 2 weeks, cooking meals I couldn't eat and organizing things I didn't want organized. Sophia, my middle daughter at 43, had called every day from Boston, her voice tight with her own grief but trying to be strong for me. And Maya, my youngest at 39, had moved into the guest room for a month, sleeping in the bed where her father had died, saying she wanted to be close to him. Maya was the one who'd stayed local, married to Derek Palmer, a financial advisor who'd swept her off her feet 8 years ago with his charm and his promises of security. They lived 15 minutes away in a sprawling house that always felt too perfect, too staged, like a showroom rather than a home. Derek had been helpful after Richard died, handling the life insurance paperwork, managing the estate details, taking care of all the financial complications that I didn't have the energy to deal with. He'd insisted it was the least he could do for family. But now, standing at my bedroom window at 3:47 in the morning, listening to a sound that couldn't possibly be real, I felt something shift in my chest. Not quite hope, because hope would be insane, but something closer to a terrible creeping suspicion that the past 6 months hadn't been what they seemed. I pulled on Richard's old robe, the one I still couldn't bring myself to wash because it smelled like him, and walked through the dark house to the back door. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it, and the September air hit my face with a chill that reminded me autumn was coming. The scratching was louder now, more frantic, and it was definitely coming from the far corner of the yard, near the garden shed where Richard had kept his tools. The motion sensor light flickered on as I stepped onto the patio, illuminating the yard in harsh white light. And there, digging furiously at the base of the shed, was a dog. A German Shepherd with a graying muzzle and a distinctive white patch on his chest. Max's white patch, shaped like a lopsided star. The patch that had made Richard choose him from the litter 12 years ago because he said it looked like the dog was wearing his heart on the outside. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything except stand there in my dead husband's robe, staring at my dead husband's dog, who was very much alive and digging a hole that was already 2 feet deep. The dog looked up at me and his eyes, those same intelligent, knowing eyes, locked onto mine. He barked once, sharp and urgent, then went back to digging. Not the frantic digging of an animal chasing a scent or burying a bone. This was purposeful, determined, like he was trying to uncover something specific. My legs finally remembered how to work. I walked across the wet grass, my slippers soaking through immediately, until I was standing right next to the hole. Max stopped digging and sat back on his haunches, panting heavily. His fur was matted and dirty, and he looked thinner than I remembered, but it was definitely him. The scar on his left ear from where he'd gotten into a fight with a neighborhood cat 5 years ago. The slight crook in his tail from when he'd slammed it in the car door as a puppy. Every detail exactly as I remembered. I knelt down slowly, my arthritic knees protesting, and reached out a trembling hand. Max leaned into my touch, his whole body shaking, and made that same mournful whimpering sound I'd heard from my bedroom. He was real. Solid. Warm. Very much alive. But I'd buried this dog 6 months ago. I'd watched them lower his body into the ground at Evergreen Pet Memorial. I'd paid $350 for a small granite marker with his name and dates engraved in it. I'd visited his grave twice, bringing flowers and sitting on the bench nearby, talking to him the way I talked to Richard's ashes. Max barked again, more insistently this time, and pawed at the hole he'd been digging. I looked down into the darkness, trying to see what he was so desperate to uncover. The motion sensor light wasn't quite bright enough to illuminate the bottom of the hole, so I went back inside and grabbed my phone, turning on the flashlight. When I shone the light into the hole, I saw it. The corner of something blue, partially wrapped in what looked like a plastic tarp. Max had excavated enough dirt to expose about 6 inches of whatever was buried there, and it definitely wasn't natural. Someone had put something there deliberately, buried it deep enough that it wouldn't be found by accident. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I should call someone. The police. Maya. Elena and Sophia. Someone who could explain what was happening, who could tell me why my dead dog was alive, and why there was something buried in my backyard that Max was desperate for me to find. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the same instinct that had made me uncomfortable with Derek's efficiency after Richard died. The same nagging feeling I'd pushed away when he'd rushed through the estate paperwork, when he'd been so insistent about handling everything himself, when he'd suggested I didn't need to read all the documents before signing them. The same suspicion that had flickered when Maya mentioned they were planning to buy a vacation home in the Bahamas, something that seemed beyond what a financial advisor should be able to afford. Instead of calling anyone, I went back inside and found Richard's old gardening spade, the one with the worn wooden handle that fit his hands perfectly. Max watched me with those intelligent eyes as I started digging, carefully at first, then more urgently as I realized how deep the object was buried. It took me 45 minutes, and by the time I was done, my hands were blistered and my back was screaming in protest. But I'd uncovered enough of the blue tarp to pull it free from the earth. It was heavy, awkwardly shaped and sealed with duct tape. Max sat beside the hole, his tail wagging slowly, like he was proud of himself for showing me what he'd found. I dragged the tarp-wrapped bundle onto the grass and sat there for a moment, catching my breath and trying to steady my shaking hands. The sky was starting to lighten in the east, painting the horizon with streaks of pink and orange. Soon it would be dawn, and I'd have to decide what to do with whatever I'd just unearthed from my own backyard. Max nudged my hand with his cold nose, and I scratched behind his ears the way I used to, the way that always made him lean into my touch with a contented sigh. He was thinner than before, and his coat was rough and unkempt, but he was here. Alive. Which meant someone had lied to me about his death. Someone had taken my husband's dog, faked his death, and buried something in my backyard that they didn't want found. With trembling fingers I started peeling away the duct tape. The tarp was thick and waterproof, the kind contractors used to protect materials from rain. Richard had used similar tarps for his construction projects, and we probably still had some in the garage. The coincidence made my stomach turn. Inside the tarp were boxes, 3 of them unmarked, sealed with more tape. I opened the first one and found stacks of documents. Bank statements, financial records, contracts with signatures I didn't recognize. The letterhead on most of them was from Palmer Financial Services, Derek's company. My son-in-law's company. The The second box contained ledgers, handwritten columns of numbers with dates going back 5 years. Some entries were circled in red, others had notes scrawled in margins. The handwriting wasn't Derek's, but it wasn't mine or Richard's either. It was careful and precise, like someone had been keeping meticulous records of something they knew was wrong. The third box made my blood run cold. It was full of cash. Bundled stacks of $100 bills. More money than I'd ever seen in one place. I didn't count it, but there had to be at least $50,000, maybe more. I sat back on the wet grass, my mind racing. Derek had been managing Richard's company's retirement accounts. He'd been the one to convince Richard to move everything into what he called more aggressive investments that would provide better returns for our golden years. Richard had trusted him because he was family, because he was married to our baby girl, because he seemed so competent and professional.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
And now Richard's dog, who was supposed to be dead, had dug up evidence of what looked like embezzlement or fraud or something equally illegal, buried in my backyard where no one would think to look. Max lay down beside me, resting his head on my lap the way he used to when Richard would sit in the garden after a long day of work. I stroked his rough fur and tried to piece together what must have happened. Someone had faked Max's death. Probably the same person who'd buried these boxes. Someone who knew I'd be too grief-stricken to question anything, who knew I'd trust family to handle the complicated parts of losing Richard. But how had Max escaped? And how had he known to come back here, to this specific spot in the yard? Dogs were smart, but this felt like something more. Like Max had been trying to get back to me, to show me what someone had hidden. The sun was fully up now, painting the sky in shades of gold and blue. I needed to make decisions. I needed to call someone. But first, I needed to know for sure what I was dealing with, and I needed to protect this evidence before anyone knew I'd found it. I gathered up the boxes and carried them inside, one at a time, while Max followed me like a shadow. He drank deeply from the water bowl I filled for him, the same blue ceramic bowl Richard had bought when Max was just a puppy. Then he ate 3 cans of the wet food I'd kept in the pantry, unable to throw away even though I'd thought I'd never need it again. While Max ate, I spread the documents across the dining room table and started reading. Financial statements from Richard's company retirement account, showing regular withdrawals over the past 3 years. Statements from accounts I didn't recognize, showing deposits that matched those withdrawals almost exactly. Transfer records, wire confirmations, investment summaries that made no sense because the investments didn't exist. Derek had been stealing from Richard's company for years, skimming money from the retirement accounts of his employees, and funneling it into offshore accounts. The ledger I'd found was someone's attempt to track it all, to document every theft. But whose ledger was it? Who had been keeping these records, and why had they buried them in my backyard? I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts, my finger hovering over Maya's name. But I couldn't call her yet. Not until I understood what her husband had done, not until I knew if she was involved or if she was as much a victim as Richard and his employees had been. Instead, I called Dr. Patricia Morales, the veterinarian who'd told me Max had died of a broken heart. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice groggy with sleep. "Patricia, it's Rebecca Chen. I need to ask you something about Max." There was a pause. "Rebecca, I know it's hard to accept, but we talked about this. Sometimes grief can make us imagine things." "I'm not imagining anything. Max is sitting in my kitchen right now, eating his breakfast. I need to know what really happened 6 months ago." The silence stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. Then I heard her take a shaky breath. "Rebecca, I think you should come to my office. And I think you should bring a lawyer." Those words confirmed what I'd already suspected. Someone had lied about Max's death, and Dr. Morales knew something about it. Someone had used my grief, had weaponized my loss, to cover up crimes that went deeper than I'd imagined. I looked at Max, who'd finished eating and was now lying in the patch of morning sunlight coming through the kitchen window, in the exact spot where he used to sleep while Richard made his coffee. My husband's dog, back from the dead, bearing gifts of evidence that would destroy my daughter's marriage and possibly send her husband to prison. Richard used to say that Max was the best judge of character he'd ever met, that the dog could sense things about people that humans missed, that he knew who to trust and who to avoid. Richard had been uncomfortable with Derek from the start, though he'd never said it directly. But I'd seen the way he watched Derek during family dinners, the way Max would position himself between Derek and Richard during visits like a protective barrier. And now Max had brought me proof that Richard's instincts had been right all along. The question was what I was going to do with it, and how much it was going to cost me to seek justice for my husband and his stolen legacy. Because exposing Derek meant destroying Maya's marriage, possibly bankrupting my youngest daughter, and tearing apart the family Richard had worked so hard to build and protect. But as I sat there watching the dog-eyed morn come back to life, I realized that Richard would want me to do the right thing. He'd spent his entire life building his company honestly, treating his employees fairly, making sure everyone had a secure retirement. He'd valued integrity above everything else. And now someone had stolen that integrity, had sullied his legacy, had used his death as an opportunity to hide their crimes. Max lifted his head and looked at me with those knowing eyes, and I swear I could hear Richard's voice in my head, as clear as if he was standing right beside me. "Do what's right, Becca. No matter what it costs." That's what he would say. That's what he always said when faced with a difficult decision. Do what's right, and let the consequences fall where they may. I picked up my phone again and made 3 calls. First to Dr. Morales, telling her I'd be at her office in an hour and I'd be recording our conversation. Second to Jacob Miller, the attorney, who'd handled Richard's will, telling him I needed to see him urgently about a matter involving potential fraud. And third to Detective Sarah Brennan at the county sheriff's office, a woman I'd met years ago through a neighborhood watch program, telling her I had evidence of financial crimes and needed to speak with someone in the fraud division. Then I took a shower, changed into clothes that didn't smell like dirt and grief, and made myself a pot of strong coffee. I fed Max again, gave him fresh water, and sat down at the dining room table with all the evidence spread out before me. I started taking photos of every document with my phone, uploading them to a cloud storage account Elena had helped me set up. If anything happened to the physical evidence, if someone tried to destroy it or make it disappear, I'd still have copies. By the time I was ready to leave for Dr. Morales' office, it was 8:30 in the morning, and my phone was ringing. Maya's name flashed on the screen and my heart clenched. I almost didn't answer, but something made me press the button. "Mom." Her voice was bright and cheerful, unaware that her world was about to implode. "Derek and I were thinking about coming over for dinner tonight. Maybe we could pick up Thai food from that place Dad loved?" I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of what I was about to do settle over me like a heavy blanket. Maya had no idea her husband was a thief. She had no idea her marriage was built on stolen money. She had no idea that her father's dog, the one she'd cried over at his funeral, was alive and had just exposed the truth about the man she'd pledged her life to. "Actually, honey, I need to talk to you about something important. Can you come over this morning? Just you, not Derek." There was a pause and I could hear the shift in her voice when she spoke again. "Mom, is everything okay? You sound strange." "Everything's going to be fine," I lied, looking at Max who was watching me with his head tilted, like he understood every word. "I just need to see you. It's important. Come as soon as you can." After I hung up, I knelt down beside Max and buried my face in his rough fur, letting myself have one moment of weakness before I had to be strong again. He licked my cheek, patient and gentle, and I knew that whatever happened next, I wasn't facing it alone. Richard had sent me a messenger from beyond the grave, and I wasn't going to waste the gift. Dr. Patricia Morales' veterinary clinic sat on the corner of Maple and 5th Street, a converted Victorian house painted soft yellow with white trim. I'd been bringing animals here for 30 years, first our family cats when the girls were little, then Max when Richard brought him home as a squirming 8-week-old puppy. The waiting room always smelled like antiseptic and dog treats, with framed photos of happy pets covering the walls. Under different circumstances it would have felt welcoming. This morning it felt like walking into an interrogation room. Patricia met me at the door before I could even ring the bell. She looked like she hadn't slept, her usually neat black hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, dark circles under her eyes. She was younger than me by about 15 years, but this morning she looked older, worn down by something that had clearly been eating at her for months. "Rebecca," she said quietly, glancing past me to the empty parking lot. "Did you bring anyone with you?" "Just my lawyer," I replied, gesturing to Jacob Miller's silver sedan pulling into the parking lot. And I meant what I said on the phone. "I'm recording this conversation." She nodded, her shoulders sagging slightly. I understand. I deserve whatever happens. Please come into my office. Jacob joined us moments later, his briefcase in hand and his expression carefully neutral. He was in his mid-60s, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look exactly like what he was, a small-town attorney who'd been practicing law for 40 years. Richard had trusted him completely, and right now I needed someone I could trust. Patricia's office was cramped and cluttered with medical journals, anatomy charts, and more framed photos of animals she'd treated over the years. Max's puppy picture was there too, stuck to her bulletin board with a pushpin. The sight of it made my throat tight. She sat behind her desk and folded her hands, not quite meeting my eyes. I'm going to tell you everything, but first I need you to understand that I never wanted to hurt you or betray Richard's memory. I was terrified and I made a terrible decision that I've regretted every single day. Just tell me what happened, I said, pulling out my phone and setting it on her desk with the recording app clearly visible. Tell me why I buried an empty casket 6 months ago, while my husband's dog was still alive somewhere. Patricia took a shaky breath. Max didn't die of a broken heart. He was perfectly healthy. But about a week after Richard passed away, your son-in-law Derek came to see me. He said he had a business proposition. Jacob leaned forward slightly, his pen poised over his legal pad. What kind of proposition? He offered me $20,000 to fake Max's death certificate and give him the dog. He said he had a buyer lined up, someone who collected German Shepherds and would give Max a good home on a ranch upstate. He said you were too old to take care of a large dog properly, that it would be better for everyone if Max went somewhere he could run and play instead of being cooped up in your house. I felt sick. And you believed him? Patricia's eyes finally met mine, filled with shame. I wanted to believe him. Rebecca, I was drowning in debt. My ex-husband had cleaned out our accounts before the divorce was finalized, and I was 3 months behind on the mortgage for this building. $20,000 meant I could keep my practice open, keep all my employees from losing their jobs. I convinced myself I was doing what was best for Max, that a ranch would be better than watching you grieve. So you gave Derek my husband's dog and told me he died. I gave Derek a sedative to give to Max, strong enough to make him appear dead for several hours. I told Derek he needed to bring Max back to me within 4 hours so I could reverse the sedative safely. But he never came back. Jacob stopped writing. What do you mean he never came back? I mean Derek took Max and disappeared. I called him dozens of times that day, texting, begging him to bring the dog back before the sedative wore off or worse. He finally responded 8 hours later saying Max was fine, that everything had worked out, and I needed to keep my mouth shut or he'd report me to the veterinary board for faking death certificates. And the empty casket? I asked, my voice trembling with barely controlled rage. Derek brought me a body. A German Shepherd, he said, had been hit by a car on the highway. No tags or microchip. He said we'd use it for the cremation and burial. I was so scared of losing my license, of losing everything I worked for, that I went along with it. I cremated that dog and put the ashes in an urn with Max's name on it. The room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. I stared at Patricia, this woman I'd known for 3 decades, who'd comforted me when our family cat died, who'd sent a sympathy card when Richard passed away, and tried to reconcile her with the person who'd participated in this grotesque deception. Did you know what Derek was really planning? Jacob asked, his voice sharp. Patricia shook her head vehemently. I swear I thought he was just selling the dog. It wasn't until later, maybe a month or 2 after, that I started wondering if there was more to it. He kept calling me, asking strange questions about Richard's habits, about when you went grocery shopping, about whether you had a security system. I told him I didn't know anything about your personal life, and he should leave me alone. Then the calls stopped. What happened to the $20,000? I asked. I used $15,000 to catch up on my mortgage and business loans. The other $5,000 I put in a separate account because I couldn't bring myself to spend it. It's still there, every penny. I know it doesn't make up for what I did, but I want you to have it back. I don't want your blood money, I said coldly. I want to know how Max escaped and found his way back to me. Patricia looked genuinely confused. Escape? Rebecca, I have no idea where Max has been for the past 6 months. Derek took him and I never saw him again until you called this morning saying he was in your kitchen. Jacob set down his pen and looked at me. Rebecca, where exactly did you find Max? In my backyard at 3:47 this morning, digging up evidence of Derek's financial crimes that was buried next to Richard's tool shed. Patricia's face went pale. What kind of evidence? Bank statements, ledgers, and about $50,000 in cash documenting what looks like systematic embezzlement from Richard's company retirement accounts. Jacob was already standing, gathering his papers. We need to go to the police immediately. This is much bigger than veterinary fraud. I stood too, picking up my phone. Patricia, I'm not going to report you to the veterinary board. Not yet anyway. But you're going to give a full statement to the police about everything Derek did. And you're going to testify if this goes to trial. Do you understand? She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I understand. Rebecca, I am so deeply sorry. Richard was a good man. And I betrayed both of you for money. I'll do whatever I can to make this right. As Jacob and I left the clinic, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger at Patricia's weakness and greed. Relief that Max had somehow survived and found his way home. And growing dread about what Maya was going to learn about her husband. My phone rang as we reached our cars. It was Maya, her voice tight with concern. Mom, I'm at your house. Where are you? The back door was unlocked and there's a huge hole in the yard next to Dad's shed. What's going on? My heart sank. Maya was at the house. With Max. Who she thought had been dead for 6 months. Stay there, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm 10 minutes away. Don't leave and don't call Derek. Mom, you're scaring me. What's happening? I'll explain everything when I get there. Please just trust me. I hung up and looked at Jacob. My daughter's at the house. I need to tell her before Derek realizes we know. Jacob nodded grimly. I'll follow you there. This conversation should happen with a lawyer present. The drive home felt endless, even though it was only 7 minutes. I kept thinking about Maya, about how she'd looked on her wedding day 8 years ago. So radiant and hopeful. Derek had seemed perfect for her, stable and successful after her string of relationships with artists and musicians who couldn't hold down jobs. Richard had reservations, I remembered now. He'd pulled me aside the night before the wedding and said something felt off about Derek, but he couldn't put his finger on what. I dismissed it as father of the bride jitters, as Richard being overprotective of his baby girl. Now I wished I'd listened. Maya was sitting on the front porch steps when I pulled into the driveway, and Max was beside her with his head in her lap. She was crying, her hands buried in his fur, her whole body shaking. When she looked up at me, her face was a mess of tears and confusion and something that might have been hope. Mom, she whispered. How is this possible? How is Max alive? I sat down beside her on the steps, and Jacob positioned himself nearby but giving us space. Honey, there's a lot I need to tell you, and none of it is going to be easy to hear. I just don't understand. We buried him. I was there. I watched them lower his casket into the ground. I cried for weeks. The casket was empty, I said gently. Well, not empty. It had another dog's remains in it. But not Max. Someone faked his death and took him. Maya's face went through a series of expressions, confusion giving way to dawning horror. Who would do something like that? Who would be cruel enough to make us think Dad's dog was dead? I took her hand, feeling it tremble in mine. Derek did it, honey. Derek paid Dr. Morales to fake Max's death certificate and give him the dog. Maya pulled her hand away like I'd burned her. No, that's not possible. Derek loved Max. He cried at the funeral. He cried at a funeral for a dog he knew wasn't dead, I said, my voice harder than I intended. Maya, Derek has been stealing money from your father's company. Max dug up evidence of it in our backyard this morning. Bank statements, ledgers, cash. Your husband is a thief, and he used Dad's death to cover his tracks. Maya stood up abruptly, nearly knocking Max over. You're wrong. You're confused, or grief is making you paranoid or something. Derek wouldn't do that. He's a financial advisor. He helps people manage their money. He was managing it right into his own pockets, Jacob interjected quietly. Mrs. Palmer, I've reviewed some of the documents your mother found. They show systematic withdrawals from your father's company retirement accounts over a 3-year period, totaling somewhere in the neighborhood of $200,000. Maya stared at him, then at me, then back at Max, who was watching her with those knowing eyes. She sank back down onto the steps, her face ashen. The vacation house. The new car. The renovations to the kitchen. I asked him how we could afford all of it, and he said he'd made some smart investments. Investments made with other people's stolen money, I said softly. Honey, I know this is devastating, but I need you to think carefully about the past few months. Did Derek do anything strange after Dad died? Did he ask you questions about me, about the house, about Dad's business? Maya was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. He asked if you were going to sell the house. He wanted to know if Dad had any safe deposit boxes or files at home that he needed to review. He offered to go through Dad's office and organize everything, but you said you wanted to do it yourself. He seemed annoyed about that. Because he wanted to make sure any evidence was destroyed, Jacob said. Mrs. Palmer, I need to ask you directly. Did you know anything about your husband's activities? Did you benefit knowingly from the stolen funds? Maya's head shot up, anger flashing in her eyes. Of course not. I would never steal from my own father. I loved him. He was the best man I knew. I believe you, I said, putting my arm around her shoulders. But Maya, Derek is going to be arrested. There's going to be an investigation, possibly a trial. Your life is about to become very complicated. And I need to know if you're strong enough to handle what's coming. She leaned against me, her body racked with sobs. How could I not know? How could I be married to someone for 8 years and not see what he really was? Because people like Derek are good at hiding who they really are, Jacob said, not unkindly. They're charming and convincing, and they know exactly how to manipulate the people who trust them. This isn't your fault, Mrs. Palmer. But you do need to make some decisions about how you want to proceed. What kind of decisions? Maya asked, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Whether you're going to support your husband or help us build a case against him. Whether you're going to fight for your marriage or accept that it was built on lies. Whether you're going to protect the man you thought you married or seek justice for your father's stolen legacy. Maya looked at Max, who had moved closer to her and was pressing his solid warmth against her leg. Dad always said Max was the smartest dog he'd ever known. That Max could sense things about people that we couldn't see. Dad never really warmed up to Derek, did he, Mom? I shook my head. Your father was always polite, but no. He had reservations he never voiced directly. I think he didn't want to interfere with your happiness. And Max, Maya continued, her voice getting stronger. Max never liked Derek either. He always positioned himself between them during visits. I thought it was just normal dog behavior, but it wasn't. Max knew. Somehow he knew what Derek really was. We sat there for a while, the three of us and Max, watching the morning sun climb higher in the sky. Normal people were starting their normal days, going to work and school, running errands, living lives uncomplicated by betrayal and theft and dogs returning from the dead. I envied them their ordinary problems. Finally, Maya stood up and squared her shoulders. I want to help. Whatever you need me to do to make sure Derek pays for what he did to Dad, I'll do it. But Mom, I need to ask. Where has Max been for the past 6 months? How did he end up here, digging up evidence at exactly the right time? That, I said, looking at the dog who'd brought my world crashing down around me in the best possible way, is something I'd very much like to know myself. Jacob suggested we go inside and call Detective Brennan, the fraud investigator I'd contacted earlier. But before we could move, a car pulled into the driveway behind mine. A black Mercedes that I recognized immediately. Derek had come home, and from the expression on his face as he climbed out of the car, he knew something was very wrong. Maya, he called out, his voice carrying that practiced warmth that had once seemed genuine. I got your text about being at your mom's house. Is everything okay? Maya stood frozen on the steps, looking at her husband with new eyes. I watched Derek's gaze move from Maya to me to Jacob, who was clearly a lawyer even in casual clothes, and finally to Max, sitting calmly beside the porch railing. The color drained from Derek's face so completely I thought he might pass out. That's impossible, he whispered. That dog is dead. Is he? I asked, standing up slowly, because he seems pretty lively for a corpse. In fact, he was lively enough to dig up some very interesting items from my backyard this morning. Derek's expression shifted rapidly, moving through shock and fear before settling on something calculating. Rebecca, I don't know what you think you found, but there's a reasonable explanation for everything. I'm sure there is, Jacob said smoothly, stepping forward. I'm Jacob Miller, Mrs. Chen's attorney. And I believe you're Derek Palmer, The financial advisor who's been embezzling from his father-in-law's company for the past 3 years. Derek's jaw tightened. I don't know what lies you've been fed, but I've done nothing illegal. I managed Richard's accounts with his full knowledge and consent. Any investments or transfers were authorized. Then you won't mind explaining the ledgers documenting every fraudulent transaction, along with the $50,000 in cash buried next to my husband's tool shed. Derek's eyes darted to the backyard, then back to me. His practiced composure was cracking, revealing something desperate underneath. You had no right to dig up my property. Your property. Maya's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension. This is my mother's house. You have no claim to anything here. Derek turned to her, his expression softening into what might have looked like sincerity if you didn't know what he was. Maya, sweetheart, your mother is confused. She's been under a lot of stress since your father died. Sometimes grief can make people imagine things, see conspiracies where there aren't any. Don't, Maya said, her voice breaking. Don't you dare gaslight me the way you've obviously been gaslighting my mother. Max is alive, Derek. The dog you told us was dead is sitting right here. So either explain how that's possible or admit what you've done. Derek looked at Max again, and something flickered across his face. Not fear exactly, but something closer to frustrated acceptance. He took a deep breath and seemed to make a decision. Fine. You want the truth? I took the dog. He was getting old and needy, and Rebecca couldn't handle him properly. I found him a good home with a breeder in Pennsylvania who could give him proper care. You faked his death, I said coldly. You paid Dr. Morales $20,000 to sedate him and declare him dead. Then you buried another dog's remains in his place and let me grieve for 6 months. It was a kindness, Derek insisted, his voice taking on an edge. You were falling apart, Rebecca. You couldn't even take care of yourself, let alone a large dog. I did what was best for everyone. By stealing him and burying evidence of your crimes in my yard? I didn't bury anything in your yard. Then how do you explain the boxes Max dug up? The ones with your company letterhead all over them? Derek was quiet for a moment, his mind clearly racing. Someone must be setting me up. Maybe someone at work who was jealous of my success. They must have broken into my office, stolen files, and planted them here to frame me. Jacob actually laughed, a short, sharp sound. Mr. Palmer, that might be the worst defense strategy I've heard in 40 years of practicing law. You're telling us that someone stole incriminating documents from your office, somehow knew your father-in-law's dog was alive, returned him to this property at precisely the right time to dig up said documents, all as part of an elaborate frame job. When you say it like that, it sounds ridiculous, Derek muttered. It sounds ridiculous because it is ridiculous, Maya said, and there was steel in her voice I'd never heard before. Derek, I've stood by you through everything. I defended you when people said you were too smooth, too perfect. But I won't defend this. If you did what they're saying you did, if you stole from my father and used his death to cover it up, then I want you to leave. Now. Derek's mask finally slipped completely. His face contorted with rage. You stupid woman. Do you have any idea how much debt your father's company was in? How many bad decisions he made? I saved that company. I made it profitable again. I earned every dollar I took. You embezzled from employee retirement accounts, Jacob said quietly, from people who trusted you to secure their futures. And when your father-in-law died, you saw an opportunity to hide the evidence and keep the money. Derek took a step toward me, and Max immediately stood up, hackles raised, teeth bared. It was the first time I'd ever seen Richard's gentle dog look threatening. Derek froze, and in that moment I saw real fear in his eyes. Your father's dog never liked me, Derek said, his voice bitter. Always growling, always getting in the way. I thought getting rid of him would make my life easier. But the damn animal escaped from the breeder 3 months ago. They said he must have run away. I assumed he was dead by now. So you didn't plan for him to come back here and expose you, I said. How could I plan for that? Derek's laugh was harsh. Dogs don't have revenge fantasies. This is just bad luck. Or justice, Maya said softly. Maybe Dad sent Max back to protect Mom and expose what you'd done. Don't be ridiculous, Derek snapped. Your father is dead. He's not sending anyone anywhere. A police cruiser pulled into the driveway, followed by an unmarked sedan. Detective Brennan had arrived, along with 2 uniformed officers. Derek's face went from angry to calculating as he watched them approach. Rebecca, he said quickly, his tone shifting to something almost pleading. Think about what this is going to do to Maya. Do you really want to put your daughter through a trial? Couldn't we work something out privately? I could pay the money back, make restitution. You mean the money you've already spent on vacation homes and luxury cars? I asked. The money that belonged to people who worked for my husband for decades, who were counting on that for their retirement. I can get it back. I can make it right. Detective Brennan was crossing the lawn now, her badge visible on her belt. No, Derek, I said quietly. You can't make this right. You stole from good people. You faked my dog's death and let me grieve. You buried evidence in my yard and manipulated my daughter. The only thing that would make this right is if you face the consequences of what you've done. Derek's expression hardened into something ugly. You'll regret this, Rebecca. All of you will. Is that a threat, Mr. Palmer? Detective Brennan asked, stepping up onto the porch. I'm Detective Sarah Brennan, County Fraud Division. I believe you and I need to have a conversation about some financial irregularities. I want a lawyer, Derek said immediately. That's certainly your right, Detective Brennan replied smoothly. Derek Palmer, you're under arrest for suspicion of embezzlement, insurance fraud, and theft. She continued reading him his Miranda rights as one of the uniformed officers handcuffed him. Maya watched her husband being led to the police car, tears streaming silently down her face. I put my arm around her, and Max pressed against both of us, offering the comfort only animals seem to know how to give. As the police cars pulled away, taking Derek toward whatever justice awaited him, I felt Richard's presence so strongly it was almost physical. He would be proud of us, I thought. Proud that we'd chosen truth over comfort, justice over family peace. Max whined softly and licked Maya's hand. She knelt down and buried her face in his fur, her shoulders shaking. I'm so sorry we didn't know, she whispered. I'm so sorry we let him fool us. But we know now, I said, kneeling beside them both. And that's what matters. Dad made sure we knew. He sent Max back to show us the truth. How did Max even survive? Maya asked, looking up at me with red-rimmed eyes. How did he get from Pennsylvania back to Phoenix? That's over 2,000 miles. I don't know, I admitted. But I intend to find out. The investigation into Derek Palmer's crimes took 3 months to fully unravel, and with each passing week, the scope of his betrayal became clearer and more devastating. Detective Brennan worked closely with federal investigators because the embezzlement had crossed state lines and involved wire fraud. They discovered that Derek hadn't just stolen from Richard's company retirement accounts. He'd been running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme, using money from newer clients to pay returns to older ones while skimming massive amounts for himself. The total damage exceeded $400,000. 23 families had been affected, people who'd worked alongside Richard for years, who'd trusted Derek because he was family. When the news broke, some of those people called me, their voices thick with hurt and confusion. How could Richard's son-in-law do this to them? Didn't family mean anything? I had no answers that made sense. I could only apologize on behalf of people who should have known better, who should have seen the warning signs. Maya took it hardest. She'd filed for divorce within a week of Derek's arrest, but the guilt ate at her anyway. She moved back into her childhood bedroom, unable to stay in the house that had been purchased with stolen money. At night, I'd hear her crying through the walls, mourning not just her marriage but the life she'd thought she had. The question of how Max had survived and found his way home haunted me through those months of investigation and revelation. The breeder in Pennsylvania, a woman named Catherine Walsh, was horrified when investigators contacted her. She'd purchased Max from Derek for $5,000, believing he was a purebred German shepherd with impressive lineage. Derek had provided fake papers documenting Max's pedigree and championship bloodlines, all completely fabricated. Catherine had kept Max for 2 months, treating him well and even considering breeding him before she noticed his age and health didn't match the papers Derek had provided. When she contacted Derek about the discrepancies, he'd stopped returning her calls. Then one morning in late June, Catherine had found Max's kennel empty, the gate somehow unlatched from the inside. She'd searched for weeks, posted on social media, contacted local shelters, but Max had simply vanished. What Catherine didn't know was that Max had help. This revelation came from an unexpected source during Derek's trial preparation. A truck driver named Ramon Silva came forward after seeing news coverage of the case. He recognized Max from the photos in the news and had a story that seemed almost too perfect to be true, except that he had receipts and video footage to back it up. Ramon had been at a rest stop outside Pittsburgh in early July when he'd noticed a German Shepherd limping along the highway access road. The dog was thin and exhausted, his paws bloody from traveling, but he seemed determined to keep moving in a specific direction. Ramon, who'd grown up with dogs on his family's farm in Mexico, couldn't leave an animal in distress. He'd coaxed Max into his truck cab with beef jerky and water, intending to take him to the nearest animal shelter. But Max had other ideas. According to Ramon, the dog had refused to settle down, constantly whining and pawing at the truck's GPS screen. At first, Ramon thought Max just needed to relieve himself, but every time he stopped, Max would trot a few yards west and then return to the truck, as if checking whether Ramon was following. "I know it sounds crazy," Ramon told the packed courtroom during his testimony, "but that dog knew where he was going. He'd look at the GPS, then look at me, then whine until I started driving west again. After the third stop, I decided to just see where he wanted to go." Ramon had driven Max across Pennsylvania, through Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and beyond, stopping to feed him and let him rest, spending his own money on dog food and veterinary care when Max's paws became infected from his initial journey. The GPS footage from Ramon's truck showed a route that had taken them through 12 states over the course of 6 weeks, with Max becoming increasingly agitated as they got closer to Arizona. "Why didn't you just take him to a shelter?" the prosecutor asked. Ramon had shrugged. "I tried twice, but both times Max refused to get out of the truck. He'd dig his paws in and growl, which he never did otherwise. He was the gentlest dog I'd ever met, but he was absolutely determined to keep going west. I figured he was trying to get home to someone, and who was I to stop him?" The courtroom had been silent as Ramon described dropping Max off 2 blocks from my house in early September, watching as the dog had immediately trotted toward my street like he'd mapped the route in his head. Ramon had followed at a distance to make sure Max reached his destination safely, and when he'd seen the dog disappear into my backyard, he'd driven away, satisfied that his passenger had made it home. "I didn't know anything about stolen money or fake deaths," Ramon said, looking directly at me. "I just knew that dog loved someone very much, and was willing to cross a continent to get back to them." After Ramon's testimony, I'd found him in the courthouse hallway and hugged him tightly, this stranger who'd shown more kindness to my husband's dog than my own son-in-law had. Ramon had accepted my tearful thanks with quiet grace, refusing any offer of payment for his expenses. "The dog knew where he needed to be," Ramon had said simply. "I was just the driver." Derek's trial lasted 2 weeks. The evidence against him was overwhelming, between the documents Max had led me to, Dr. Morales' testimony about the fake death, Catherine Walsh's account of the fraudulent sale, and financial records that showed every illegal transaction in damning detail. Derek's lawyer tried to argue that he'd been under extreme stress, that Richard's death had affected his judgment, but the prosecution easily proved the embezzlement had started years before Richard got sick. Maya attended every day of the trial, sitting beside me in the gallery, her face an expressionless mask. I knew people were watching her, judging her, wondering how she could have been so blind. But I also saw something changing in her with each day of testimony. The guilt was still there, but it was being slowly replaced by anger. Not just at Derek, but at herself for the warning signs she'd ignored. When the jury returned after only 4 hours of deliberation, their verdict was unanimous on all counts. Derek Palmer was convicted of embezzlement, wire fraud, theft, and making false statements. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in federal prison and ordered full restitution to all victims, plus penalties. The vacation home in the Bahamas would be sold, along with the cars and anything else purchased with stolen money. Derek would leave prison as a middle-aged man with nothing to his name and a felony record that would follow him forever. As the bailiff led Derek away, he turned one last time to look at Maya. She'd met his gaze steadily, and I'd seen her mouth move, forming words I couldn't hear but could read easily enough on her lips. "I hope it was worth it." The months after the trial were about healing, though that word seemed insufficient for the work required. Richard's former employees received their stolen money back, plus interest, which helped but couldn't fully repair the trust that had been broken. Several of them visited me to express their gratitude for pursuing justice, even though it meant exposing my own family's crimes. Maya started therapy and slowly began rebuilding her life. She'd lost her husband, her home, and her sense of reality, but she was young enough to start over. She took a job at an elementary school, teaching art to children who didn't care about her ex-husband's crimes. Watching her with those kids, seeing her smile return gradually, gave me hope that she'd be okay eventually. Elena and Sophia had flown in for the trial, and we'd spent long evenings talking about everything that had happened. They'd both felt guilty for not being more involved after Richard died, for leaving me alone with my grief while Derek had free rein to manipulate the situation. I'd assured them there was nothing they could have done, that Derek had been careful and calculating, but I knew they'd carry that guilt for a long time. Max settled back into life at the house as if he'd never left. His paws healed, and with regular meals and veterinary care, he regained the weight he'd lost during his cross-country journey. He slept in his old spot by the fireplace, followed me from room to room, and seemed content to spend his remaining years in peaceful retirement. But there were moments when I'd catch him staring out the window toward Richard's garden. His ears perked up as if listening to something only he could hear. Sometimes I'd swear I felt Richard's presence strongest during those moments, like he and Max were having a conversation I couldn't quite overhear. One afternoon in late spring, almost a year after Max had returned, I was planting tomatoes in Richard's garden when Maya came outside to join me. She'd been living with me since the divorce finalized, and we'd fallen into a comfortable routine that reminded me of when she was young, before she grew up and married a man who'd betray everything we held dear. "Mom," she said, kneeling beside me in the dirt, "can I ask you something I've been wondering about?" "Of course, honey. Do you really think Dad somehow sent Max back to us? That it wasn't just coincidence or good luck?" I sat back on my heels and looked at the garden, at the tomato plants that were already showing tiny green fruits, at the roses Richard had planted on our 30th anniversary, at the oak tree where he'd built the girls a treehouse when they were small. This garden was Richard's legacy, his peace, the place where he'd worked through his problems and found his center. "I think," I said slowly, "that love doesn't end just because someone dies. I think Richard loved us enough to make sure we'd be protected, even after he was gone. Whether he somehow guided Max back to us or whether Max's own love and loyalty brought him home, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that the truth came out and justice was served." Maya was quiet for a moment, absently pulling weeds from around the tomato plants. "Derek asked to see me," she said finally. "His lawyer sent a letter saying he wants to apologize, to explain things from his perspective." "What did you tell them?" "That I didn't need his apologies or explanations. That the only thing I wanted from him was for him to serve his sentence and leave us alone." I reached over and squeezed her hand. "I'm proud of you, Maya. It takes strength to set boundaries like that." "I learned from the best," she said, squeezing back. "You could have let this go, Mom. You could have taken Derek's offer to pay the money back quietly and avoided all the publicity and pain. But you chose what was right over what was easy. Your father would have expected nothing less." We worked in companionable silence for a while, the spring sun warm on our backs. Max was lying nearby in the shade, his eyes closed but his ears twitching at every sound, ever vigilant even in rest. He was 13 now, getting old by German Shepherd standards, and I knew our time with him was growing shorter. But for now he was here. We were here. Richard's garden was blooming. And the truth, however painful, had set us free from the lies that could have destroyed us. That evening, I did something I'd been putting off for months. I took Richard's urn down from the mantel and carried it out to the garden. Maya followed me, understanding without being told what I was finally ready to do. Together, we scattered the rest of his ashes among the tomato plants and roses, returning him fully to the earth he'd loved. Max sat beside us, his head tilted as if watching Richard's spirit settle into the soil. And in that moment I felt something shift, a weight I'd been carrying finally lifting. Richard wasn't in that urn or in some distant cemetery. He was here in this garden, in the dog he'd loved, in the daughter who was learning to be strong again, in the justice that had been served because he'd raised me to always choose what was right. "Sleep well, my love," I whispered to the evening air. "Thank you for sending Max home. Thank you for making sure we'd be okay." The wind rustled through the oak tree, and I chose to believe it was Richard's way of saying he'd always be watching over us, even from beyond the grave. 2 years after Max had dug up the truth in my backyard, I received a letter from the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Derek Palmer was up for early release consideration due to good behavior in prison overcrowding. As his victim, I had the right to submit a statement to the parole board explaining how his crimes had affected my life, and whether I believed he deserved early release. I'd sat at my kitchen table for a long time, staring at that letter, feeling the weight of the decision. Maya had already submitted her statement, a carefully worded explanation of the psychological damage Derek's betrayal had caused and her belief that he hadn't served enough time to truly understand the magnitude of his actions. But what did I believe? Had 2 years in prison changed Derek Palmer into someone who understood the harm he'd caused? Had he truly felt remorse for stealing from people who trusted him, for manipulating his wife, for faking an innocent animal's death? Max, now 15 and moving slowly with arthritis in his hips, had nudged my hand with his graying muzzle. I'd stroked his ears and thought about everything that had happened since that early morning when his scratching had woken me from grief-induced insomnia. In the end, I wrote my statement by hand, wanting my words to carry the weight of personal testimony rather than typed formality. I told the parole board about Richard's employees, about Melanie Jackson who'd been 3 months from retirement when she discovered her pension had been stolen, about Tom Reeves who'd had to postpone his daughter's college education because the money he'd saved was gone, about Susan Yamada who trusted Derek with her late husband's life insurance money and lost everything. I told them about Maya, about watching my daughter blame herself for not seeing through the man she'd married, about the therapy sessions and sleepless nights and the way she still flinched when she saw men who looked like Derek. And I told them about Max, about a dog so devoted to his deceased owner's family that he'd traveled 2,000 miles to bring us the truth, about how some forms of loyalty and love transcended death itself. Derek Palmer has served 2 years of a 12-year sentence, I wrote in closing. The people he hurt will carry the consequences of his actions for the rest of their lives. I believe justice requires that he serve his full sentence, that he have time to truly understand that his choices have permanent repercussions. Early release sends the message that white-collar crime is somehow less serious than other offenses, that stealing someone's retirement is less harmful than stealing their television. I respectfully urge the board to deny his request for early release. I mailed the letter and tried not to think about it too much. Whatever the parole board decided, I'd done what I could to ensure Richard's legacy wasn't just about the company he built, but about the principles he'd lived by. Integrity, honesty, the courage to do what was right even when it was difficult. 3 months later, I received notification that Derek's request for early release had been denied. He would serve his full sentence. Maya cried when I told her, not from sadness but from relief that her statement and mine had been heard and valued. Max passed away peacefully in his sleep that same week, as if he'd held on just long enough to make sure justice was fully served. I found him in his favorite spot by the fireplace, his head resting on the rug Richard had bought specifically because Max liked to sleep there. He looked peaceful, like he was just dreaming about chasing rabbits in Richard's garden. This time there was no fake death certificate, no empty casket. Dr. Morales, who'd spent the past 2 years trying to make amends for her role in the original deception, came to the house personally. She examined Max gently, confirmed what I already knew, and helped me make arrangements with a crematorium that treated pets with dignity and respect. I buried Max's ashes next to Richard's roses, in the garden where they'd both spent so many happy hours. Maya, Elena, and Sophia all came for the small ceremony, and we took turns sharing our favorite memories of the dog who'd saved our family by refusing to stay dead when someone tried to erase him. He was the best dog, Elena said, wiping her eyes. Loyal and smart and brave. He was Dad's best friend, Sophia added. And in the end he was ours too. He brought us the truth when we needed it most, Maya said quietly. Even though it hurt, even though it destroyed my marriage, I'm grateful he came back. We deserved to know what Derek really was. I didn't speak. I couldn't, not through the tears. Instead, I placed a photo of Richard and Max on the small memorial stone I'd had made. The two of them together in the garden on a summer afternoon, both looking happy and at peace. That night, I dreamed of Richard for the first time since he'd died. In the dream, he was in his garden, and Max was beside him, young and healthy again, his coat gleaming in perpetual sunshine. Richard looked up and saw me, and his smile was everything I'd been missing for 3 years. Thank you for taking care of him, Richard said in the dream, though I somehow knew he meant both Max and our family. Thank you for being strong enough to do what was right. I love you, I told him. I miss you every day. I know. But you're going to be okay. All of you are going to be okay. When I woke up, the sun was streaming through my bedroom window, and I felt lighter than I had in years. Richard was at peace. Max was at peace. And slowly, painfully, we were learning to be at peace too. The garden bloomed that spring more beautifully than it ever had, the tomatoes growing fat and red, the roses perfuming the air with their sweet scent. Maya had started dating again, carefully this time, taking things slow with a gentle elementary school teacher who coached Little League on weekends. Elena and Sophia called regularly, and we'd started a tradition of quarterly family gatherings where we'd cook Richard's favorite meals and tell stories about him. Life went on, as it always does, even after loss and betrayal and the kind of pain that feels like it might break you forever. We carried our scars, but we also carried our strength, our love for each other, and the knowledge that truth and justice were worth fighting for even when the cost was high. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when I was working in the garden, I'd feel a presence beside me, a gentle weight against my leg, like a dog leaning in for affection. I'd look down and see nothing, but I'd feel everything. Richard's love, Max's loyalty, the unbreakable bond between a family that had survived the worst and come out stronger on the other side. The story of how my late husband's dog came back from the dead to expose my son-in-law's crimes became something of a legend in our small community. People would stop me at the grocery store or the library to tell me they'd followed the trial, that they'd been rooting for us, that Max's journey had inspired them. But for me, it was never about inspiration or legend. It was about love persisting beyond death, about justice prevailing over deception, and about the extraordinary lengths one devoted animal would go to protect the family his owner had left behind. Max had been more than just a dog. He'd been a messenger, a protector, and in the end a hero. He'd crossed a continent to bring us the truth, and in doing so, he'd saved us from living the rest of our lives built on lies. That was worth more than all the money Derek had stolen, more than any material possession we'd lost. Because truth and integrity, as Richard had always taught us, were the only things that really mattered in the end. And thanks to one remarkable dog's determination to come home, we'd learned that lesson in the most profound way possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.